we need to embrace that vision that we are family as the body of Christ, and there should be an ownership that, or a sense of stewardship that goes with that beyond just our own nuclear family when we think about functioning together that way. And when a community starts moving like that, that's so powerful.
Hey, thanks so much for checking out this video. The Canadian Church Leaders Network is all about seeding a hopeful future for the church in Canada by coming alongside pastors to serve, connect, and resource them as they go out and do the same for their communities. That's the vision. So if you're looking to be further resourced, connect with more church leaders across the country, or hear incredible stories of God's faithfulness in the church in Canada, follow us on Instagram by searching CCLN, visit ccln.ca, or subscribe to our channel below. Thanks again for watching this video. Have a good one.
Okay, well, first, let me just say this, Sid. I have been doing this podcast for over a year. I think we must have interviewed 50 or more people. I think you're the second or third person to do in person.
Come on.
So this is so special. This has been like a pandemic podcast.
Yeah.
And it wasn't intended to be that. It wasn't just a pandemic hobby. We wanted to do this beforehand. Yeah. So you're in the office, you're in the room. It's amazing to have you. And I'm just realizing one common denominator between one of the other in-person guests, Matt Menzel. You guys have the same hairstyle.
We do. And in fact, there's more things that Matt and I have in common.
Like what?
Well, I mean, and to be honest, Jay, I'm going to work really hard at not being offended that that's like kind of your primary place to go. Like, I think we as bald people would just like the world to know that we're known as something more than just our lack of hair.
But you and Matt, like, you could have told me that you guys, this is just a style choice because it works for you two.
Well, we're praise the Lord for a nice round head. Matt also, by the way, grew up at the camp and I have to go here, Jay, you know this.
Okay, I have to give a bit of background. Sid and I spent a lot of time together.
Yeah.
Sid leads a number of things. We'll talk a lot about them, but one is a podcast for youth volunteers in local churches and working in parachurch space. And I'm a frequent guest on it. And every time Jeremy, who's like the host, says, tell us a bit about yourselves.
I know.
Sid ends up giving this long answer that always ends up talking about Green Bay, which is the camp that his wife works at. And so I do want you to tell us all about it because this audience doesn't know you, but he's laughing because it just... Anyways, it's happened before. It's an inside joke. And we can't do that too much in this conversation. Right. That might not serve the audience.
It might not serve well, but Matt grew up going to that camp, living at that camp.
And your wife works at that camp. You live there.
Yeah, we live there because she's the director of the camp.
In Kelowna.
Not
a bad place to live.
It's not. You know, we're really thankful for it, Jay. Like, I got to be honest, when I get to travel broadly, I love coming home to Kelowna. Like, it's warm, it's refreshing. I get to be in the mountains real quick. So that's been a real gift to me. Yeah, really thankful.
And give me a bit of the plot line of even just with geography, where you guys have lived and the different ministry kind of outposts you've had as a family, because that actually gives a bit of context to who you are and what you do.
So I think when I think about that, especially in church ministry, Jay, and in youth ministry, because that's our focus is youth ministry primarily, I like starting where I grew up. So I grew up in a really small town, Elkhorn, Manitoba, 500 people.
500 people?
Yeah, dude.
And how close is the nearest biggest town?
Well, Verdun was the closest, nearest, biggest town in my mind.
Yeah.
25 kilometers away, and a town of about 1,500 at that time. And I was like, that's a big town. They had a Chicken Delight.
What's that?
Come on, Jay. Chicken Delight. Like, we went there and had.
Is it like
chicken.
A KFC?
Yeah, kind of.
Come on.
Like a Prairie KFC.
So, I mean, I was going to make like a cheeky comment, but I actually have a real soft spot in my heart because when I started doing youth ministry stuff, or actually just church stuff, I wanted to do business. Yeah. I got into ministry because I kept getting invited to speak at youth events.
Yeah.
And before I ever got invited to speak at a youth event in a major metropolis like Calgary or Edmonton, it was small towns like that.
Yeah.
And I'm really thankful for that journey because when I think about the landscape of Canada, and I'm passionate about urban centers, but for us to see renewal in the country, it includes these small towns.
So much.
And when you see churches in small towns, you realize like the average local church is working with especially in youth ministry, volunteer parents, volunteers,
100%.
putting in their time, funding it on their own. And that's like the engine behind so much of the ministry happening.
Yeah, and I mean, there's lots of things that are changing in our country. Small towns are in some places really drying up, and there's because farming is becoming big business if it's going to be sustainable. So the number of families that need to be in that place to sustain a community are changing. So there's lots of changes happening. But there's still so much significance in space like that. So you think about our community, Jay, like my dad, who was a Mennonite lay pastor, started our first non-denominational evangelical church with a Pentecostal lay pastor.
Wow.
So we had this both Pentecostals and Mennonites together starting this little church in this little community. And that's where I grew up. That formed me. And we didn't have a youth ministry. We had volunteers that did Bible studies and different things like that. I grew up going to a little camp in Saskatchewan called Kenosi Lake Bible Camp. That was probably such an incredibly forming space for me. That was huge. So then after that, went to Bible college. Our family, we all went to Bible college for at least a year.
Did you go to Briarcrest?
Yeah, I went to Briarcrest. Yeah.
Shout out Briarcrest.
Shout out to, we love Briarcrest. I love Briarcrest. My boy's going back to Briarcrest.
Which is amazing.
I know, it is. So did that. My plan was to be a phys ed teacher. I wanted to really, in Verdon. I thought if I could get Verdon or Brandon and be a phys ed teacher there, living the dream, which was still a great dream. But when I was at Briarcrest, people started saying to me, hey, you should consider youth ministry, which again, I didn't really have a paradigm for it because we never had a full-time youth ministry. So I didn't have vision for that. God started working my heart. And so when I was in university, felt called back into ministry, ended up back at Briarcrest, finished my BA, did a year of my MA. And then my first position was in Canmore, Alberta, in a little AGC church. They'd never had a youth ministry before.
What does AGC stand for?
Associated Gospel Churches.
Okay.
Yeah. So they'd never had a youth ministry before. We had about 5 kids in our senior high and about 11 kids in our junior high. And it was awesome.
And did they pay you full time to do that?
Yeah, dude.
Was that a new position for them?
Yeah. So listen to this. We're in a church where we probably had, Canmore was unique because it had such a transient population. But we were in a church that would gather anywhere from 100 to 200 people on a Sunday. Just depends how good the snow was on the mountain.
Right.
Right? So they had a vision for Next Gen Ministries. So we had a part-time children's pastor, full-time youth pastor, and then one other senior pastor.
Wow.
And so we just went after it, and it was awesome. I was there for 4 years, started Truth Matters Ministry, which was the ministry that the umbrella I spoke under to youth.
And because when did that start for you? I think a lot of people who might know you because they probably heard you at one point speaking at a youth event or a youth conference. And when did that start for you?
Yeah, so that was really interesting, Jay. When I was heading back from university to head back to Bible college for my 3rd and 4th year.
Sid, I just got to admit something. You and I have this really unhealthy pattern. I didn't realize this had happened to me. I'm so used to just trying to throw roasts at you that while you're saying meaningful things on this meaningful podcast, I'm just shutting down. And so if you see me grin and then I'm realizing that we're filming this because you're in the office.
So good.
It's so unfair. And so we need to push through.
Right. We got to push through.
Because I'll just tell you the roast. I was going
please.
to say, and when did you ever prepare for those messages when you're traveling and speaking? Or is not preparing just something you started late? But that's such a bad thing to say because it doesn't help our audience. For anyone listening, you're an incredible speaker, and I just probably should edit it out.
But you know what? It's good. We're inviting them into our relationship, Jay.
I just reflecting on it. I'm just not sure it's a healthy relationship.
Maybe we need some intervention.
Maybe. Anyways,
mediation. So
keep going on your story. Don't let me interrupt you.
Okay, stop interrupting me. But there's a couple of actually key moments, and we'll see if they're healthy or not. I'll try to just be pointed. So when I know I'm heading back to Briarcrest, people start calling me and asking if I'll come speak at camp. Starts with Youth for Christ. In fact, funny story. We were volunteering, my wife and I we're volunteering for Youth for Christ. We didn't have a speaker for one of our events. So someone said, hey, someone's got to speak. And they're like, Sid, you need to speak. And I'm like, oh, stink. Okay. It goes really well. And then they're like, you need to speak all the time for this. And I'm like, yeah, I do. So funny, for the next one coming up, this is while I'm at university, I don't prepare. I keep thinking I will prepare and I never do. And I get up on the stage and I have nothing to say. Literally nothing to say. And I shouldn't reveal this. I literally go, shoot, I have nothing to say. And I walk off the stage, and the executive director, his name is Mark Anderson, as I walk off the stage of Youth for Christ in Brandon, comes to me and he goes, I go, I'm so sorry, Mark. He goes, that's okay. And then he goes, you need to keep speaking. And he goes and buys me my first lapel mic and says, I think God's calling you to be a speaker.
Whoa.
And brings that to me after like the greatest failure I'd had in
That's
the moment.
a powerful moment.
Isn't that wild?
So he obviously saw something. People
He
saw
did.
something in you.
They did.
And for those listening that maybe don't know, like Sid, what the gift you've been is you're not someone who really wants the stage. You're not someone who's going after it. But I've just seen you for way over a decade now. It's probably been, have you been doing this for over 2 decades?
Yeah.
Consistently pointing students to Jesus through the scriptures.
Yeah.
And I know those are huge values for you, to anchor in the scriptures.
Thank you.
And to point people to Jesus, and really honor you for that. Like, it's just an
thank you.
incredible investment you've made. And early on, when I was like invited to speak at things and do youth ministry stuff, you know, there wasn't a ton of examples, but there's guys like you, Phil Can, and you guys insisted on not turning it into a business. Like, refused to do that. There's always the backdrop of the U.S. speaking circuit, and no real issue for those that are like honoring Jesus within that system.
Yeah.
But I remember this example from you guys of just championing the big youth group, the big youth conference, and the local youth retreat, and giving the best in both environments. I saw you guys do that. It inspired me to do it, and yeah, thanks for doing that, man.
Yeah, well, you know, when you grow up in a town of 500, you go to a camp in southern, you know, and you've been affected by a communicator there that's radically changed your life. It starts to make you go, oh, these moments really matter because they matter to me. Like that's that. So I'm really thankful, Jay, to the Lord. Like, he's allowed me to have these really kind of diverse experiences growing up that I think have shaped me. So after Canmore, I ended up in Lethbridge, you know, part-time in a larger church, larger youth ministry, loved it while continuing to do speaking stuff. And so and there for 11 years, which was those were such forming years and really significant for me in terms of both youth ministry and leadership development. So I was invited onto the lead table at the church, you know, and we were a church of like 12 to 1,400 on a weekly basis kind of idea. Do you know what I mean? So like, it's large enough that required,
especially in a place like Lethbridge. That's
totally
massive,
right, and really great. Had a great staff, great lead pastor, like just such good experiences. But I look back now, and I'm really thankful for the diversity of experiences that God's given me, and so it's been a great journey. Yeah.
Was there a moment where, like surely you were thinking, hey, there's a trajectory here towards senior leadership in the context of a local church? Was there a real decisive moment where you decided, no, I'm really meant to give my best energy and thinking to the space of children and youth?
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, Jay. I think because I never really saw myself as a real leader or even an organizational leader. And again, I wonder if part of that is the environment I grew up in. Like, my dad was a teacher, mom was a nurse. We were never a part of leading organizations or those sorts of things. Like, I just wasn't modeled. Even our church experience was so relational in nature, like small, 30 people showing up on a Sunday. I don't know if I ever aspired to like real organizational leadership very much. So that's not in my head, but I do know at around like 36, I started wrestling with my calling a little bit, like if it should remain with Next Gen Ministries. And I ended up going to Arrow. So Truth Matters itself, like, here's a funny thing. I remember my board with Truth Matters said, hey, you need to grow and expand. And I had no vision for what that meant, had no idea. Tried a couple of things, completely didn't work. Actually, it was fails. So then I went to Arrow, and at Arrow, my mentor, I had a couple of mentors come to me and say, hey, you need to take ownership of the experiences that God's given you in the years in youth ministry, and you need to start intentionally mentoring other youth workers.
Wow.
So what that did at that moment is it solidified for me a vision of I could actually remain in youth ministry for a really long time.
Wow.
So I think that was a real transition moment for me that removed even the idea of other types of leadership.
Yeah.
And so I guess when you ask the question, like, Jay, I just don't have very many spaces kind of when I think back in my journey where I really considered something else, but that might have been kind of the closest to it. And the Lord kind of shifted that pretty quick.
And you and I have talked before, like, there's this sentiment that, like, you'll hear people say, don't let youth ministry be a stepping stone to senior leadership, wherever. And I think I get the sentiment, but I don't like that idea we talked about, because like it makes a lot of sense that there's going to be people who for a season of their life have favor with the next generation because of proximity of age.
Yeah.
And youth ministry is a great environment for gifted, godly men and women to grow their leadership.
Yeah.
And that's part of the journey potentially towards senior leadership. And often it goes along with your own life journey. Like you begin having kids, you begin to have to get married, and you begin to see your peers differently, and you grow up with that. And it's a great leadership development pipeline in the context of the local church.
Yeah. Let me speak to that for just a second, Jay. I think, and I want to speak to senior pastors maybe for a minute, or senior leadership in a church as well. I really think that we need to change our vision of what we would like to see developed in our youth pastors or youth workers. So, and I want to be careful when I say this. There is great value as a youth worker seeing that you're called to like mentor, love, and care for 10 to 20 kids.
Right.
Like that's beautiful. And there's lots of spaces and environments where we should do that. But I also want to say that, and even within those environments, I think that we should also be asking the Lord to grow our leadership capacities, because, both you and I, and we've talked about this, Jay, that the only way to go deeper in the lives of kids, to go broader, so get more kids that we can disciple in deep ways and do it in a sustainable manner, is to continue to build our teams of volunteers. And that requires leadership, right?
Yeah.
Like that requires the ability to help create systems and structures that can facilitate their mentoring ministry with kids, and then continue to kind of scale that, if we're going to use that type of language. And any environment should have that. So when I think back to Canmore, when we had 5 senior high kids and 11 junior high kids, and I didn't know organizational language, like organizational leadership language, but that's not what we ended up doing. We invited around a number of volunteers. We started gathering them, training, equipping, facilitating their work, figuring out how to design program for it. But here's the point I want to make. I think as senior leaders, you should be looking to develop the leadership capacity of your youth pastors for a number of reasons. Number one, again, it's the only way to continue to expand it's a really important way to continue to expand the work of reaching more kids in deep ways within your community. They got to grow that leadership capacity. Number two, the issues that we're dealing with these days are more complex, I think, in many ways than before. And there's the need to be able to like change and shift with programming. We've noticed that over this last year and a half. And in order to be able to remain effective in ministry, we have to be thinking through how to do change management, how to do good communication, how to make sure that we're focused on mission and vision and values, so that our strategies change, but those things don't. Like those are all really important leadership bits that I think as a senior pastor, you should be thinking about investing in your youth pastors that way. And then the other part, and this is, I think, where I feel like almost subversive. And I'd love to do a deep dive here, so I'll come to it third, that our youth pastors, like you should, if youth pastors are listening to this, even if you wanted to stay in youth ministry, you should develop your leadership gifts so that you have such value to your organization that you're invited to the lead table, where you're actually affecting like systems, structures, processes for the sake of passing faith to the next generation. And then finally, you should be preparing yourself that if God would call you to more senior leadership, you've learned good lessons in that space so that you can move into those senior leaderships and still bring a vision for passing faith on to the next generation. But here's the other part that I think we forget, Jay. Like, if as a senior pastor, you can have a vision to develop the leadership capacity of your like youth ministry and your point youth worker in particular, you will not have a better environment to train, equip, and prepare the lay leaders of your church than youth ministry.
Yeah.
So think about this. Like if you're running a healthy youth ministry where you're primarily working through your volunteers to shepherd kids, and of course, we are embracing the priesthood of all believers when we speak about this idea. Do you know what I mean? That we see that we're facilitating their work as primary pastors in kids' lives. All of a sudden, you have people who, number one, have a fairly good chunk of time that they can give into the journey, but we don't always have at different stages of life. But most of our youth workers are younger, so they have more discretionary time. That's wonderful. We should embrace that. We should use that. They're working with kids at a stage of their development where when they want to process the most significant questions, they're generally starting to look to someone other than a family member to do that. And that's part of differentiation. So who do they look to? They look to the person that's like, that's the most significant older person in their life, which is should be a volunteer youth worker. So now you're learning on how to like actually shepherd people through like significant kind of moments of their personal journeys.
Yeah.
That's not a small thing to learn. And then all of a sudden, you know, as is the journey of humanity and especially adolescence, you're going to have crisis moments that you have to deal with. So now you're figuring out how to manage crisis, how to relationally journey with people in crisis, how to bring other people into that journey. So if you just stop and think about it for a second, like if I would think about one of my volunteer youth workers, let's say when I was in Lethbridge, and they started with my students in grade 9 and committed to leading that small group through grade 12. And they really became like relationally invested with those kids.
Yeah.
Because that's the vision we made. By the time they've been with those kids 4 years, not only have they like affected those kids for 4 years, but essentially they've been in a 4-year training program to become the best lay leader that our churches have. And they probably won't stay in youth ministry forever, but they might stay in ministry in the church for a really long time. And the training's been phenomenal. So when I'm talking, you know, I was talking with some lead pastors in a church the other day. And I just said, hey, when you have this vision for your youth ministry, do you know what I mean? Where your point leader, whoever it is more about facilitating the work of volunteers. Not only are you making a difference in those kids in that ministry right now, you're preparing the best lay leaders for your church for the next 10 to 15 years.
Yeah.
Like there's no better place for that equipping to happen, in my opinion. Obviously, I'm going to advocate for that.
I want to kind of parse, you've said so many amazing things there, and there's a lot of threads, and I don't know which one to pick. I think on one hand, what stands out to me is that youth ministry is this incredible space to raise up leaders. I mean, I've experienced this as a church planner, that some of our best small group leaders, the consistent thread is they led a small group as a youth leader. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, I've noticed with adults, like whether they're 40, 50, 60 years old, their primary training and experience with leadership or leading a small group or discipling individuals was at a summer camp or was in a youth ministry. And like, because there's so much, like the season of life that often happens is there's more time. So it's that incredible idea. And I think that in of itself is a reason why, because one of the cases I want to make with you, and I hope we can circle back to it, is youth ministry needs to be a concern for more than just the youth pastor. And so we'll park that idea and keep coming back to it. But then this idea of like the youth pastor who, you know, that sentiment of, is it a stepping stone? You know, and I think that we're trying to say, hey, if all it is a stepping stone, that's not going to work. Right. But it's normal if you mature out of it. No, that's the wrong word. It's normal if your calling changes or 100%. Different seasons of life. I don't want to say mature out of it, edit that out. They're not going to edit it out. This is me telling the listener, just forget I said that. You get it. That's not the hardest. You get what I'm saying. But there are some people who carry on in youth ministry because they see not just the difference it makes in youth, but the leadership development opportunity way beyond just that 10-year season. And you're one of those guys. And obviously you've done it not just in a local church, but now you're coaching multiple churches through Youth Worker Community, which is the ministry you lead. You guys are training volunteers and youth pastors across the country and around the world. And I just wanted to really, you know, and you might, if there's some other direction you want to go, I just really wanted to hear why you have decided to keep your energy on youth ministry.
Let me just quickly say, Jay, I want to just touch that statement you made. Hey, if you're someone who wants to be in senior leadership in a church, don't be embarrassed about starting in youth ministry to cut your teeth there. Like if you come out of college, you're 22, 23 years old, we're like that's actually a good space to do it, but be all in while you're there. Be all in while you're there, and think about what you're doing. You know, can you leave a lasting mark that can make a difference beyond your physical presence in that space? But be all there, learn what you need to learn, make a difference, and it's okay to move on. But I'm going to ask that God would continue to give you a heart for passing faith to the next generation. I don't care where I should. Okay, so I think that's important. Now, why did I stay in this? Well, I think first of all, you know, I would say, of course, God called me, but really practically, I've just never felt like there's been a lid for my leadership development in youth ministry. I've always felt like there's opportunity to continue to grow that lid. And I think a couple of things happened. When I started in youth ministry, like relationally present, I was there. So every day after school, I was picking kids up. We'd go mountain biking. We were in Canmore. We'd go mountain biking. We'd go for Cokes. We'd do that. Like it was never ending and I loved it. I was in. Weekends, going for hikes with kids, do like all relational, all in. And we'd build teams, but I was still right on the ground. And then I remember, Jen and I got married and Jen was all in. So we continued to roll that way. And then we started having kids. And then I started, getting a little older. And I went through a little bit of a crisis where I was like, man, I don't have the same kind of energy for that. There's other responsibilities in my life that are starting to kind of creep. And I actually went through a time where I wondered, hey, maybe I'm not called to youth ministry anymore. Like that season I talked about in the mid-30s. And someone came to me and just said, hey, you're kind of an idiot if you think you can continue to do youth ministry.
Sounds like a really sweet person.
Yeah, it's really beautiful, right? But it was really freeing for me to go, oh, I think I do need to change a little bit on how I do this. But that doesn't mean I've lost my calling or my effectiveness in youth ministry, but there should be a different way of doing this now. And so that shifted me where I started like thinking about some of that leadership skills, the way that I facilitated, saw myself as working more with volunteers to create the systems and structures and facilitate their role with kids in particular.
Can I just interrupt you really quickly and just pause? Like you've said something a couple of times that I just want to like lock into my own imagination. Is there's a shift in thinking about, like you described a season of youth ministry where you're in the life of the students, you're going biking after school, you're doing those things. And a couple of times you mentioned this idea of like, as you mature as a leader, you begin thinking about how do I mobilize more volunteers? And that comes with then how do I build systems and structures and training and support so those volunteers can thrive so they can be in the life of the students.
Great.
And I actually don't think that's just a youth ministry trajectory. I think all of us in leadership, in the local church, I'm sure it's true in other organizations, but I just have no expertise there, where we begin to think, oh, I'm not just discipling 11 or 12 people, I'm equipping people to be disciple makers. I'm equipping people. And then all of a sudden it makes sense. Like, so then I'm creating systems and structures. And that doesn't mean you still don't have those 10, 11 students or whatever it might be in your life, but you're beginning to say, oh, my role as a pastor, as a leader is that. And I think that's why, I get really inspired by young pastors. I think about a friend of us that we have in common. He said to me one time, he goes, dude, you put me on kids ministry, put me on youth ministry, put me on worship ministry. It doesn't matter if I can even play the guitar. I'm going to do the same thing wherever I'm going to make disciples. I'm going to call out giftings. I'm going to mobilize people to make disciples, reach people far from God. That train of thought, that's like, and that's a shift for me because, because when you think about yourself as your passion being towards the people you lead, you say things like, I could never do kids ministry. I just don't love being in a room with a bunch of 4 or 5-year-olds. I like my kids. I just don't like my kids' friends. And I do like my kids' friends, but I just don't want 12 of them in the room. But then when you go, oh, actually what I'm called to do is mobilize people in their giftings, in their calling for the purpose of making disciples and making Jesus known. You can put it in any context.
It doesn't
Worship
matter.
ministry, children's, city outreach, whatever it might be.
And I think it's important to remember, Jay, like some of us have like specific leadership gifts that allow us to build those structures and systems and facilitate those kinds of movements and growth naturally out of a gifting. Not all of us have that, right? Like we're all called to lead, but not all of us have organizational leadership gifts. But it doesn't mean that we can't all grow our skills. So we can all continue to grow our skills, somewhat for the kinds of environments that God places us in. So it is true. Like there are some people that are just way more gifted. Like Jay, you and I are gifted differently. So when I see the things that you do with your organization and all those different areas, I go, oh, that's so amazing. That's not me, but that doesn't mean that I shouldn't steward my leadership gifts or skills in the space where I am. And I think I'd like to advocate for that, both for youth workers out there. You need to steward your gifts and skills and grow them. And then for lead pastors, like invest in your youth workers, that they would continue to grow and lift in those leadership areas, and call them to that they would steward that well. Like give them a vision for how what they're doing makes a difference way beyond just the youth ministry. Really does.
I love that. Can you, I want to ask kind of a meta question. How are we doing with the next generation? Like you are part of a lot of research projects with the EFC and other groups. You're on the ground. Anecdotally, you're seeing a lot of youth ministries. How are we doing out there, man? Like, I'm reading the data that it seems like at an increasing rate, students are disengaging with the life of local church. The pandemic accelerated that. At least that's what it seems. Tell me what you're seeing.
Yeah, being a pretty emotional dude, it would probably depend on the time of day when you ask me that question, how I'm going to respond.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But I was thinking about this. Like, generally speaking, I'm somewhat of an optimist. But you're right. Like, the data isn't positive. You know what I mean? Like, we have it seems to me like we have far too many kids that are disengaging from faith in church by the time they finish college.
Yeah.
The research continues to point that way. I actually don't know, Jay, how much that research is changing. Like when we did the hemorrhaging faith research in 2011, we would say that in evangelical churches, it was kind of 50%. 50% of kids, children or youth, who had a significant church or faith experience as a child or youth, young adults as a child or youth, were disengaged from church and most from faith by the time they're done college. When we did renegotiating faith, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, the numbers weren't that different, to be honest.
Right.
I think we'd kind of moved maybe from 50 closer to 60%, but and we weren't focusing on that, but the numbers hadn't changed a ton, which was interesting to me. I think what was concerning for me was where we started seeing people really disengage from an understanding of Christ being Christocentric, an understanding of the role of Scripture and the authority of God in Scripture in our lives, like some of those things. So people still affiliating with Christian faith, but some of those deeper rooted elements not in place in the same way. And so, of course, that contributes to lots of, dysfunction and different ways of living, et cetera, et cetera. I would say, just personally, I would say that I'm obviously concerned greatly about the next generation, how they define faith, how they understand what it means to follow Jesus. I think sense of identity is so significant within and without the church. Like that, I'm deeply concerned that we're in a space where identity primarily comes from within, that we create, as opposed to allowing God to give us our identity, that we discover and then surrender to that. Those kinds of things really, really concern me a lot. And it's deeply rooted both within the church and outside of the church with young people, deeply rooted. But at the same time, as I'm working with youth leaders and volunteers, I'm really encouraged by the number of youth workers and youth leaders that are really thoughtful about passing faith to the next generation, about growing their commitment. Like, I'm really excited about the number of churches where point youth workers are going, man, I need to do a better job of discipling my leaders so that they can disciple the kids in their care. And that gives me a ton of hope because now we're kind of scaling. And again, it's not just about the fact that that's going to make a difference in the 12-year-old or the 15-year-old, but also in my volunteer leaders who are involved in this as well. So I see that affecting broadly. So I'm really encouraged by that kind of movement. And the other thing is, Jay, like, I just believe that God always has remnants in place, like always. You and I were talking the other day about Elijah when he's so depressed over the state of Israel and people following after God. And God says, there's like 5,000 who haven't bowed a knee. And you're not aware of them, but they're there and I'm at work. And so that kind of narrative.
Dude, I need that word right now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like looking over the city of Vancouver or
bro.
Whether it's Canmore or whatever city, it's like, feels like, man, and there are, but it's just of course there are, but some days it feels like, is anyone else?
Oh, dude. And it does feel overwhelmed, which is probably the other reason why, Jay, what you guys are doing, gathering as networks, gathering in groups is really important because we have to be reminded that we're not the only ones.
Yeah.
And this is what a beautiful age this is, where we can jump on these podcasts or these platforms and be reminded, I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
I'm part of something much bigger. Now we have to get in physical space. We actually have to feel that. Yeah. We actually have to know that. We have to get shoulder to shoulder. But we're not the only ones. And if we just stay within our own space as the only ones, we'll be totally overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, it's too much.
Yeah.
And it feels like a tsunami, a cultural tsunami of values that are so opposed to our values as followers of Christ that are being so normalized that it feels so overwhelming. But that's not reality.
Yeah.
Like, that's actually what's really real, is that God is still on the throne, that Jesus Christ is still at work changing lives, that in the midst of the hardship, Jesus Christ is transforming us as individuals. The Holy Spirit is still advocating on our behalf before the Father and still advocating in our lives from the Father. He's still working. That's what's really real. And we're not done. Like, as long as we breathe, he is working, he is redeeming, he's restoring. So, Jay, like, we have to continue to fight to see what is actually real. Like, as leaders, we have to continue to reset the lens, our vision, to know what is real. Because if we don't, we're going to continue to do this work out here and be overwhelmed by it, because this feels really big, really against us, really alone. But that's not what's real. That's not true. So I think we have to continue to be in these spaces where we are reminded of what is true.
Yeah. So as you look at the youth ministry landscape, and when I say youth ministry landscape, I particularly mean just ministry to the next generation, whether it's teenagers or even younger.
Yeah.
The research is showing increased disengagement. The research is also showing that amongst even Christian youth, there's just massive worldview shifts.
Yeah.
And so the task is in front of us.
Yeah.
What can we do? Like, let's just speak to the senior leader right now.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily in the weekly programming of the youth ministry. What kind of decisions can they make on a board level from the pulpit on Sunday mornings? Budget, resourcing, like, what do we do? Like, or what's working? Like, how can we begin to move towards this cause and not just continue to say it seems like it's going this direction?
Yeah, that's great. So a few thoughts come to my mind. Number one, if you're a senior leader, you need to champion passing faith on to the next generation. The idea of passing faith on to the next generation, to your people, you have to champion that. Like, you have to do it. If we don't do that in a generation, we don't have our church. Let's be really clear on that.
Can I press you a little bit? Can you define that a bit more? When you say, like, champion passing faith on to the next generation, what does that sound like?
So
what does that look like?
Let me just speak to that for a second. Here was a conviction that here's a thing that I'm wrestling with. You take a look in, like, Mark chapter 10, right? Where Jesus is speaking to the masses. His ministry is going, like, by all accounts, it's really successful. And the disciples are all in. So there's big growth kind of happening. And then it says that the people start bringing children to Jesus, that he would touch them, right? And the disciples are all of a sudden, they're like, whoa, this is kind of messing up the system here. And they start, like, speaking against the people. They say, quit. And then Jesus sees this, and it says he becomes indignant, like he's really upset. And essentially says, don't hinder the children from coming to me. Okay, so I'm looking at that, I'm going, okay, so what am I doing that's hindering the children from coming to me? Like, I do a personal evaluation from coming to Jesus, personal evaluation, all that kind of stuff. But I think there's something bigger at play here. Here's what I think is happening, is the disciples actually think they're trying to help his mission, not hinder it. And Jesus says, you're hindering it. So here's what I think that might mean for us in senior leadership in churches. It's helping our people come to a place where we, especially in this complex season that we're in, where everything is changing, systems and structures that we've been used to for so long are gone. There's just so much shifting happening that I wonder if as churches, we need to just continuously try to posture ourselves in a position that says this: Lord, if there's anything we're doing that we think might be helping your kingdom work, but's actually hindering the children from coming to you, could you reveal that to us? And we would be open to just, like, surrendering that and changing. Like, if we would just take that humble disposition, and if as church leadership we would lead our people, our leadership, into that kind of a space, I think we have a lot of hope for passing faith on to the next generation. But that's really hard. Because we hold on to lots of these things. We as we're getting older, it's more about what's this experience for me and that sort of thing. And I think that's great. We need to have spaces that are ministering to, like, everybody. I get it. But I want to advocate and say that sometimes we need to, like, be willing to, like, hold some of these things that we think are really important for ministry, but actually might not be. Like, there's a chance they might not be, that we're blinded, we don't see, which we all are. And we should just say, okay, Lord, like, lead us. And I think, in light of that too, Jay, like, when we see that kind of vitality start happening, with younger people in our church, it brings life to the whole, like it brings flourishing to the whole being. So I think that's really important. The other thing I would say is, just practically speaking, if I'm a senior leader in a church, I'm going to if I'm in a church that has a paid point leader, I'm going to that paid point leader and saying to them, hey, is there anything that I can do to help you encourage and equip your volunteers?
Yeah.
Because just let me know.
Yeah.
Like, do you need me to show up and do a 10-minute train or affirmation? Like, just let me know. Children's ministry, youth ministry. Like,
it's fascinating that sometimes the people training the most important sector, being children and youth, most important for two reasons. Most important one, because it's the most vulnerable sector, essentially. Like,
absolutely.
Like, so the training needs to be best because of the nature of that. But also from like an ROI point of view, this is your church of 30 years from now. And so, and everyone listening who's pastoring 50-year-olds know that it's almost impossible to unwind what was established in their teen years.
Yeah.
Like, I'm still living out so many of the convictions that were imparted to me from my youth pastor, for better or for worse.
Yep.
About prayer, about the Bible, how I approach it, guilt, shame frameworks, all of those things.
Yeah.
And so, most important for a lot of reasons, rarely gets the most senior leaders' attention.
Yeah.
The most experienced people are rarely training the volunteers who are working with the most important demographic.
Let me throw this idea. I'm just thinking about this. I'm not convicted of this, but let me throw this idea out there. So, Jay, we believe in like the wisdom of the elders and the older. Like, I don't deconstruct that at all, right? Like, we need older leading, sharing, guiding, directing. But if you really wanted to make a difference in your community, or you wanted to reshape, like create a new cultural way of being, say in an environment where you're in, maybe an activity group, a school, whatever it is, or a city area, our young adults especially have like means and ways of moving ideas, thoughts, and values that I, as someone who's almost 50, don't fully understand. So if I can actually get their heart and I can actually shepherd and mentor them, we can release a movement that can move like faster, deeper than what I could even actually imagine or dream of. So I just keep thinking, are there ways, we should be thinking that way. Like, when I bring in those people, if I mentor and invest in them, I can actually like kind of 10x our ability to start doing like cultural shifts. I think that's what I think. And that's just, so I'm wrestling with that. And I think that's why as senior leader, if you're not thinking consciously about how to like lean in to that, next generational reality, I think you're missing a really significant opportunity and missional imperative, to be honest with you.
I remember being at a youth conference. I think it was in New Brunswick, and or in Nova Scotia, and there's a big youth conference, and there's a senior pastor you and I both know out there, and I was out there sharing or something like that, and in the audience of like 2,000, I saw this like senior pastor with his like 13 youth.
Yeah.
And they're like a couple-year-old church plant, and they've got like 13 kids, and he was like right in there with them. And I'm like, and that's not every senior pastor's job,
I get it.
But there's something about him going, I can't afford to not be investing in this generation. We don't have youth pastor yet. We're not there in our church journey, whatever it might be. And it just really moved my heart. And again, we talked about this earlier, leading the next generation is often mobilizing volunteers, that kind of thing. But there's something about that picture that really gripped my heart.
Yeah, when I think about Lethbridge was such a healthy space for me, Jay. And our senior pastor, his name was Ian Lawson. Number one, he actually ended up volunteering in our youth ministry, which was bizarre to me. He was like, seriously, I think he was almost 60. He had a little bit of space, and he goes, let me invest in the youth ministry.
Wow.
I'm not 100% convinced that him being a small group leader for like 4 years in our high school was necessarily the best youth of his time. And it was hard. And we just facilitated him to be able to show up when it worked, and put him in places where we could leverage the best of him. Like, we started learning for him to be like a 22-year-old. That's not going to be functional or even helpful. But here's the thing that was huge. He so believed in passing faith to the next generation that he just empowered me, encouraged me, was present when I needed him to be present. When we needed to lean into our volunteers because there was some activity that was happening, kind of within our volunteer community that was detrimental to the mission that God had called us to, he was right there with me, affirming, encouraging, loving, that kind of stuff. And then when it came to our budget, he didn't just throw money at our youth ministry. We needed to be able to show how it was being used effectively and being well stewarded. But when we could do that, when I could grow up, give him a good proposal or a vision for it, it was a no-brainer because it was a missional imperative. So just to be in that kind of space with that kind of support was really powerful for us. He was always advocating for us. And I think even if you do that, like that's going to be your win. But we would train our volunteers every week. We would gather before youth for an hour. We'd eat together, and then we'd engage ministry. And if he would just show up, walk in the room, and for 10 minutes just go, man, you guys, thanks so much for what you do. This is so important to our church and our ministry. That was like game-changing momentum for those volunteers for that night and beyond. So that kind of positioning is wonderful. Let me just say this again. Like, Jay, when we think about your work at The Way, and we've been interacting on it, here's just something that's been pretty cool. Like, you're running a ministry right now that is primarily run by volunteers.
Yeah.
I love it a lot. And now, and then you're really intentionally thinking about how to build systems and structures and invest in those volunteers so they can be freed up to do really great ministry. But even in the teaching plan, you have your most senior leadership committed to showing up to help with teaching youth for those youth. You're not playing the games. You're not going on the retreat. Don't need to. You got phenomenal volunteers with all sorts of energy to do that. But you're there to invest in kind of like the most important moments where you can. And I think that says something amazing to the young people that are part of the ministry here. Like that vision to me is so powerful.
I know that the idea of the church family being a community, not just around young people, but around for individuals, is something you're passionate about, and it's personal for you. Tell me where you kind of, in your own story, really woke up to just the power of what the church family can be for an individual.
So interesting. So when I was thinking about, as I was going through adolescence, what most shaped me, I thought about camp a lot, but I really thought about showing up in our little church consistently week after week, and just like adults of other families, loving, inviting, caring, like we were part of the whole family. Like I always felt like we were, as a body of Christ, we were actually a family together. I wasn't able to articulate it or process it when I was younger, but looking back now, I see that and go, oh, that was really powerful in my life. And then now what's been really interesting for me, like, as my kids have moved from early to late adolescence and now into young adulthood, there's been plenty of seasons where, as my boys go through differentiation, they try to create a little bit of emotional distance from me to create space for the, ownership of their own identity. It's been a fascinating experience. So I'll never forget, like when my son was engaging like a pretty intense conversation or topic, and he goes, "Dad, what do you think about this? Like, are you one of the weird ones or what?" I was like, well, I don't think I'm one of the weird ones necessarily in this conversation, but I said, "Son, would you like to know what your dad actually thinks about this?" He's like, "No." I'm like, oh, okay. And so you're kind of like, whoa, that's a little bit of a shock. But here's what the win was for me. One of my best friends, who is the dad of one of my son's really good friends, also took an interest in my son. So he took him out for, a Coke or a slush and had like great conversations with him that were really powerful. And then on the flip side, I took his son out, and we did Cokes, and we went to activities and did things together, and was able to help influence there. And it was a safe relationship. He could actually talk about his dad to me and know that, but we started, investing in each other's families, which was really powerful. Now, we know that the nuclear family has like a profound effect on the formation of our kids. We know that. But there's this stage of life in adolescence where that foundation is making a difference even when we don't understand it. But if someone else can come in and engage the journey that shares our values, that voice is so powerful as that young person really begins to own their own identity and their own faith, where they're known more by their first name than their last name, that kind of idea, where they can process these issues that don't necessarily feel safe because of kind of the emotional connection that's happening in that nuclear family. And we don't have to be afraid of it. It's normal and helpful. But I think as families in our church, we should be aware of one another's families actually, and look to be helpful in that. And here's kind of, Jay, here's where theologically I'm wrestling with this. I'm taking a look in the New Testament, and it just seems to me almost without exception, and I'm huge on the nuclear family. I love the nuclear family. But it seems to me almost without exception, when Jesus speaks about family, he talks about the body of Christ. Like he talks about the church. He said, my family are those who do the will of my Father in heaven. You just see that image over and over again. And I really think that we need to embrace that vision that we are family as the body of Christ.
Yeah.
And there should be an ownership that, or a sense of stewardship that goes with that beyond just our own nuclear family when we think about functioning together that way. And when a community starts moving like that, that's so powerful.
It's powerful, man.
Yeah.
I love that. I love the work you're doing with youth worker community, and I just love for you just to take a minute to just talk about some of the projects you guys have coming up. I don't know when this is going to air, but we just love to hear how people can get involved. And I know that you're like going to be humble and not want to promote your stuff, but I really believe in the work you're doing, and just would love for you to just take a few minutes to, describe what the organization's doing, ways that people can get connected. Yeah. I'd love to hear more about it.
Cool. So, it's a really neat season, Jay. Over the last few years, we've just seen kind of like some expanding opportunities that have been coming. So this is kind of how we're functioning right now. We have 5 like divisions or branches or focuses, I guess you could say, as an organization. And our primary mission with youth worker community is to encourage and equip youth workers to better disciple kids in their care. So that's what we're looking to. We want them to help kids know Jesus more. And so we do 5 different things primarily. Number 1, we do conferences. So we've been running conferences across our country pre-pandemic, and we do them in multiple cities across the country.
Are you bringing them back?
We're bringing them back.
Come on, bring them back.
We're bringing them back. So a couple of things we're doing there, and that just allows us to gather physically together with a heavy focus on volunteer youth workers in that space. We're doing 2 things. This October, we're doing a tour across the country. Yeah. We're hitting like 21 locations in 16 days. It's just going to be a buzz, about 3-hour events with youth workers. We're really excited about that. In January, we'll start conferences again. We're shifting some of the structure on that, so it's a little bit more scalable and sustainable. Excited about that. We do conferences. And then in the pandemic, we've been doing virtual conferences. And we partner with different organizations like Alpha, Youth for Christ, other organizations we love, and do those. So we do conferences. Okay, that's one thing we do. We think it's important to still physically be in space together to encourage and equip each other. The other thing we do is what we call our coalition. So it's
do all of the 5 things you do start with the letter C?
Close.
Not all of them.
No, bro.
Let's see if we can get it there.
I think we can. We might be able to get there.
Okay, I'm just going to make notes. So you got conferences, we got coalition. Okay, what's the coalition?
Yeah, coalition is our 2-year program for like training vocational youth workers.
And this is accredited, right?
Yeah, it's part of a BA or a full MA. So we're accredited in partnership with other organizations to do that. Sweet. So it's full on. But what it is, it's like the trades. Essentially, you remain in your local context. You have like a ministry mentor in that space, someone who's doing discipleship for you in that space, and we help create the structures for that to take place, those relationships. You come to us for 8 one-week modulars, and we bring in professors from around North America for those modulars, and you're part of a cohort as well. So it's integrative, it's affordable, it's accessible, it's experiential, and there's this coaching journey that happens. Mm-hmm. Love that. So we got the coalition. Then we've got, this is where we go off the rails, dude. We've got like lots of digital resources we've been creating. Mm-hmm. So we have our podcast.
Call it content.
Content. Oh, I love that. We have
content bracket digital.
My brain's starting to just run now. So we have podcasts and blogs, webinars, curriculum that we do, and we partner.
It's super helpful. I remember even when I was serving the church before we planted, I was just pointing our youth leaders to those 15-minute weekly podcasts, because like if that's something they could listen to on their way to youth group,
totally,
on their way to work, and that's a great resource.
Yeah,
stuff you guys have been so helpful.
We're super thankful for that. We do research, so we partner with lots of research projects.
Get that on the letter C.
Keep working on that.
You just keep going.
And then the final one that we're involved in, which I'm really excited about right now, is like ministry design, coaching, and consulting. So we're working with, if we just did a coaching and consulting, we could keep it there, but it's the ministry design part that I love so much. So churches will hire us to come in, take a look at their youth ministry, do assessments, figure out how it's aligning with the vision and values of the church as a whole.
And this is brilliant. This is why I like it. And I know if someone's thinking this sounds like an ad, like there's no ad here. I just actually think this is important stuff. And what I like about this model with the coaching and ministry design is we're saying, hey, you're saying, hey, we can come in and support whatever volunteers
Totally.
or paid staff to bring lift and elevation to it.
Yeah.
And I think this is part of a new way that ministry is happening,
Yeah.
where we're saying, hey, we can learn from others. We can take the best practices.
Yeah.
And sometimes like the simple example to me is like, hey, if there's a form, like you'll do like a youth worker code of conduct form.
Totally.
And some youth pastor or volunteer sitting in a room for 5-6 hours trying to write that thing, get it edited. And somewhere else in Canada or somewhere else in the world, someone's done a much better job doing it.
Yeah.
And they've got it vetted by professionals. So just like, and imagine if you could just grab that. Well, if you scale that out to even youth ministry design, curriculum workflows, all those best practice youth ministry training. And I feel like what you guys are doing is trying to say, hey, how do we create access for the stuff that just can't just be photocopied and shipped, but still is this work that's been done that you can take the weight off of a local context.
Well, and even think about this, like Jay, when we think about our community, we have access to like literally hundreds of years of youth ministry experience in our network. Do you know what I mean? So when we come into a church environment, I can meet with a senior leader. They can share with me their frustration or struggles, and we can go, oh, hey, I think there's a way forward on this. And we can access certain people that can help us with that. We can build you a strategic plan and show you how to implement it, help execute. So we can kind of become a bridge between like senior leadership of a church and their youth ministry and help kind of create that space to become very functional. And it's been really rewarding to be able to be in that space where we're actually working. Like when we do our ministry design, we're hired by church leadership to work with their youth ministry, not to just affect their youth worker, but actually the ministry itself, so that there can be something that's really effective and sustainable beyond the life of just an individual in that space, but rather for the life of the church itself. And that kind of stuff really thrills me. I love it.
So still no C word for the research. If somebody, one of the
Well,
listeners,
no, we went to research. Oh, we couldn't go content.
the content was the digital one.
Yeah.
You can only use content.
We could give a prize if someone could come up with this.
Collating data. We'll work on it. Somebody will send something in, and it'll be good. And
this is really
that'll
wonderful.
really help you guys out.
I didn't know, Jay, that coming to this podcast would be so beneficial for
you get
my
a free
ministry.
kind of marketing consult.
Yeah, free. Oh, so I thought I was actually maybe I'd pay. Like I was open
No,
to,
that was free. Sid, last question, then we can wrap it up. Is you can take this however you want. I know this about you. You live life in ministry with a perspective. There's a verse in, I think it's the Psalms or it's Proverbs, says, "Teach me to number my days aright, that I may gain a heart of wisdom." And I know that you are trying to live your life, invest your days, consciously knowing that we don't know if we have decades, and there's this sense, and this is one of the reasons why I'm so drawn to you as an individual, is because you're trying to wring yourself out. You rest, you Sabbath, all these things, but wring yourself out for the gospel, refresh in Christ, refresh in community, and wring yourself out more. And I would just love to hear you share just a bit about that posture. I know you probably would be self-deprecating and say most days you don't, but there's a real urgency to the gospel, a real invitation to go all in. And I see that model in your life, and we'd love to hear your heart on that as we wrap up.
Yeah, I think I'm not quite. You'll pull out where you want me to go with that, but I'll go. Let me try to answer it just from what I'm thinking right now for a minute. Jay, my life is a bit unique. I acknowledge that. So when I was in high school, my father, who was 48 years of age, died of a heart attack real suddenly, and I found him actually in our home as a high school student, and I remember praying God would give him back, and it didn't happen. But I remember going into another room and just like messed up. But actually, I think like the only time I heard God's voice in my life was he said, "Hey, I'll be your father now. I got you." Like there was a real sense of that. But that began to create for me this narrative that life is pretty short. And one of the things that happened is my dad often spoke of heaven. Like it was so weird. Like for my years of life from 14 to 18, he spoke of heaven constantly. Drove my mom nuts because she was like, "Don't you like our life here on earth?" But what I didn't know had happened is 4 years before that, he had awakened in the middle of the night, thought he was dead. His heart was going nuts. And he had just said, "Lord, either you need to like send someone else to help raise my boy, or you got to give me a few more years."
Wow.
And that changed his vision. And that started to give me a vision of this idea that, man, I love life. Dad was all in, loved life, engaged, but life is short. And if this is all there is, man, like I don't know that what I'm doing is worth it, but if there's something more to come, then I could actually, like, it would make sense to me if there's something more to come that I would be more willing to sacrifice more here because there is actually a better way coming. So that kind of narrative, I think, drove me sometimes in some unhealthy ways, but sometimes in some really healthy ways. That our hope, we have to bring a greater hope, Jay. We have to bring the hope of God working now, but also God having something more for us later that's tangible, physical, real. There's an eternity coming that we're called to. That's wonderful. So whatever we sacrifice here now is very small compared to what we get to achieve there. And when I'm talking about sacrifice, I'm not saying sacrifice your family. I'm not saying sacrifice these responsibilities and joys that God has called us to in this space. I'm saying, be sacrificial and loving the people that God's calling you to love, doing the work that God's calling you to do, in a really wonderful way that reflects the kingdom now. And so I just think like that vision has been so set for me. So this, we were together, Jay, what was that, 2 years ago now, in Abbotsford doing a conference when I got the call that my brother had died again, like 55 years of age, same thing as my dad did. And so then this past spring, on March 29th, I turned 48. My dad had turned 48 on April 1st. I turned 48 on March 31st. 19 days later, he was in eternity. And so I remember making it to that 19th day and then going, oh, wow, the rest of my days are bonus time. Like I'm living in bonus time. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I'm trying to be careful about what that vision is I give to my own boys, how to express that in a healthy way. But the truth of the matter is, Jay, like we're all living on borrowed time. Like we really are. And we need to have a right, we have to continue to fight to get that lens of reality, that there's something more coming. There's a greater hope we're called to that's real, tangible, physical. And so, so we live into that. We call other people to this reality that's better. And that, for me, that's giving me the energy to continue to stay in it. And I'm thankful for that. And there's many days when that's not the case. But that vision has shaped me in what I'm doing. If I didn't believe there was something, greater, I live a good life. I'm thankful for my life, honestly. There's lots of people around our world who are sacrificing much more for the sake of the kingdom. And like Paul, it makes sense to them that if eternity wasn't real, they were the greatest fools of all. If the resurrection wasn't real, they're the greatest fools. We don't say that here because it doesn't cost us much. But that should motivate us to live the way that God would have us live in this space that we're in right now. And then it's okay. It's okay if much is against us. It's okay if, we're losing, territory or whatever, because there's something more that we're about.
Wow. Well, I appreciate your time so much, Sid. Thanks for sharing with us today and the work you're doing to shape those who are shaping the next generation. It means a lot, and I'm all in with you. Anything we can do through this network or through relationships, we're with you, buddy.
Thanks, bro. Love you.
Hey, before you go, we want to let you know about a few things we do here at CCLN that might serve you as you lead yourself and others. First, we have a podcast. The Canadian Church Leaders Podcast features brand new episodes every 2 weeks, featuring conversations with church leader voices from across Canada and the world. We also send out a newsletter to our network every month that contains helpful resources and content that our team curates for pastoral ministry in the Canadian context. And if you're a senior pastor, or you're on the trajectory towards senior leadership in the Canadian church, we run a 2-year program called the Church Leaders Incubator, created for young pastors to strengthen their character and ministry for long-term effective senior leadership. You can find everything that you need at ccln.ca. There, you'll find ways to listen to our podcast, sign up for our newsletter, or learn more about the incubator. Lastly, if you or your church wants to partner with CCLN in our mission to lift up and serve pastors across Canada, we invite you to consider making a one-time or regular donation. You can do that or find out more at ccln.ca/partner. Thank you so much for watching this video. From myself and the CCLN team, we love you and we are cheering you on.